My wife and her sister fired me. We don't need lazy people like you, they said. Next day their dad asked, did you even read the contract? Turns out I was still co-chairman of the company's IP. Without my signature, they couldn't run anything. They thought they won, but I held all the power. Daniel had barely slept the night before, working into the early hours finalizing numbers for a critical expansion proposal. He walked into the boardroom the next morning clutching spreadsheets, hopeful and ready to present. Instead, he was met with cold silence. Vanessa, his wife of 8 years, sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes void of warmth. Her sister Rachel lounged beside her with a smug grin, as if she'd already won something. The tension in the room was sharp, electric. Daniel, Rachel said, voice clipped and professional, we're letting you go. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. Daniel rifled through old folders in his home office, files he hadn't touched in years, back when he still trusted Vanessa to stand by his side. Papers were yellowed at the edges, tucked inside a folder marked Aethertech Merger 2020. He scanned line after line of dense legal text, heart pounding, eyes desperate for something, anything, and then there it was, at page 17, buried beneath paragraphs of corporate jargon and merger terms. His name stared back at him. Daniel Morgan, appointed co-chairman of the Aethertech subsidiary, with full authority over all assets. His breath caught. His heart kicked. This wasn't just a footnote. It was the spine of everything. The patents, the tech, the trademarks, all the intellectual property that powered the entire company. They couldn't fire him from that. They couldn't even touch it without his approval. For a long second, he just stared at the page. Then a slow, genuine smile crept across his face. Not the polite one he wore in boardrooms, not the diplomatic grin he used to smooth over family fights, but something real. Something fierce. They thought they'd cut him loose. They had no idea they'd just shackled themselves. He picked up his phone and texted Marco just 2 words. Found it. Marco's reply came almost instantly. Sit tight. Let them figure it out. Daniel leaned back in his chair, a quiet sense of power rising in his chest. Let them squirm, let them panic. They'd thrown him out the front door, but they'd left him holding the keys to the entire kingdom. Excuse me? He asked, thinking he'd misheard. We don't need lazy people dragging this company down, she continued. Lazy? The word echoed in his mind like a cruel joke. He'd sacrificed everything for this business. Their business. Long nights, endless travel, stress that had left him sleepless and hollow. He'd given Vanessa's family everything he had. He looked at Vanessa, expecting her to speak up, to defend him. Instead, she stared blankly at the table, her fingers drumming softly, like this was just another item on the agenda. She didn't say a word. The silence crushed him more than the insult. Still, Daniel didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice or demand answers. Instead, he smiled, a tight, practiced smile, nodded once and simply said, "Good luck, then." Then he turned and walked out, each footstep heavy, echoing through the boardroom like the end of something sacred. Daniel sat slumped on the couch, the silence of the house pressing in on him. This was Vanessa's home, really. Cold, spacious, perfect in all the ways that made it feel empty. His mind kept circling the same questions. How could she? Why didn't she say anything? Was this always the plan? His phone buzzed, cutting through the fog in his head. It was Marco, the company's accountant and one of the few people Daniel still trusted. Heard what happened, the message read. I don't think they read your contract. Daniel blinked at the screen. My contract? He hadn't thought about it in years. Not since Vanessa's father, Victor, had still been in charge and treated Daniel like a son. He fired off a quick reply, "What's in it?" But Marco didn't respond right away. Daniel stood up, unease coiling in his chest. Something wasn't adding up. He poured a glass of water, trying to quiet his thoughts, but the word lazy kept ringing in his ears. Lazy? He'd rebuilt their logistics after a supplier collapse, personally landed a multi-million-dollar account, and stayed up for nights on end while the rest of the family reaped the rewards. Vanessa had seen it all. She knew what he'd done, and yet she just sat there. Silent. His phone buzzed again, another message from Marco. Check the merger clause from the tech acquisition. You're still tied to it. Daniel froze. The tech merger. 5 years ago, they'd acquired a small startup to boost the company's patent portfolio. Daniel had spearheaded the whole deal. Now, that single sentence from Marco lit a spark in his chest. He set the glass down, hands shaking just slightly. If there was something buried in that paperwork, something they hadn't noticed, maybe they hadn't won, maybe the story wasn't over. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. His phone buzzed again, another message from Marco. They're asking about the patents. Think they're starting to panic, and that's when it finally clicked. The realization settled over Daniel like a wave of cold clarity. Without his signature, the company couldn't move, not a single inch. No product launches, no licensing agreement, no new deals with investors or clients. All of it lopped up behind his approval. The entire company had been unknowingly built on a legal bottleneck, and Daniel was the cork. The tech, the designs, the brand itself, all flowed from the IP buried inside that little subsidiary no one had paid attention to. Except him. He stared at the coffee in his hand, still steaming, while his mind raced. They didn't just underestimate him. They built their empire on his back and never once looked down to see whose shoulders they were standing on. And now they were stuck, dead in the water, and all Daniel had to do was nothing. Daniel sat on the couch, the contract spread out before him, its legal language now carrying the weight of a revelation. Just then, his phone lit up. Victor, Vanessa's father, was calling. He hesitated. Victor hadn't reached out since the firing. What could he possibly want now? When Daniel answered, Victor didn't waste time. "Danny," he said, voice low and strained. "You're still co-chair of the subsidiary. They can't run the company without you." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't have to. The truth had already taken root. Victor sighed on the other end, frustration bleeding through his words. "They didn't read the damn clause, did they?" Daniel could hear the disbelief in his voice. Not just at Vanessa and Rachel's mistake, but at how spectacularly they'd shot themselves in the foot. The girls thought they'd staged a hostile takeover, but in reality, they'd left the real power untouched. And Daniel still had both hands on it. He looked down at the words again. Co-chairman, full authority over subsidiary assets. Victor's voice was still going, half angry, half bewildered, but Daniel was hardly listening now. He knew what he had. He knew what they didn't, and for the first time in days, he wasn't grieving anymore. He was calculating. Daniel sat in the quiet of his living room, beer in hand, the bottle sweating onto his palm as he stared at the glowing screen of his phone. Another message from Marco. "Noel's freaking out, says they need your signature or the whole company's dead in the water." Daniel smirked. Dead in the water. He let the words settle in. Not because he enjoyed watching them fall, well, maybe a little, but because it proved what he'd suspected. The moment they fired him, they'd triggered their own collapse. And now they were scrambling. He didn't reply right away. He wasn't in a rush. The company he'd bled for was falling apart, and he hadn't even raised his voice. All he'd done was stand still. And they were the ones unraveling. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting a warm orange across the windows. Daniel took a sip, the bitter taste grounding him. Somewhere across town, Vanessa was probably pacing, Rachel yelling, the staff whispering in hallways, suppliers pulling back, deals stalling. And him? He was still silent, calculating. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about leverage, and he had all of it. Daniel sat at his desk, the contract open beside him, its once forgotten words now weaponized. The board had been silent, but Marco's texts made the situation clear. Chaos was already spreading through the halls of Crimson and Vale. So Daniel stopped waiting. He opened a new email. Not to Vanessa, not to Rachel, but to everyone who mattered. Clients, partners, suppliers, legal contacts, even the board. The subject line was simple: notice of licensing freeze effective immediately. He laid it all out. The clause from the Aethertech merger. His sole authority over the IP, the legal freeze on all trademark usage, patents, and active contracts until new terms were renegotiated, with him. No emotion, no venom, just cold, sharp facts. He ended it with a single line. "I'm not asking for reinstatement. I'm asking for accountability." Then he hit send. The silence that followed was delicious. Tense. Ticking. Like the calm before a detonation. By evening, Marco was back in his messages. Boards freaking out, half want to bring you back, other half think the girls can lawyer their way out. Daniel leaned back, watching the city lights flicker through the window. Let them try. This wasn't just a corporate memo. It was a shift in power, and they felt it. Deals were frozen, money was halted, people were scared. The same board that had watched him get fired without flinching was now watching their company bleed, and they finally realized who was holding the tourniquet. The next day, Daniel sat across from Vanessa at a quiet restaurant on 5th, the same place they used to celebrate anniversaries and close deals. But today there was no wine, no laughter, just distance. She looked tired. The polished, confident exterior was cracked now. Hands fidgeting with the menu, eyes darting to avoid his. She ordered a salad with a voice that tried to sound casual. Daniel got a burger. Simple. Unbothered. When the waiter walked away, she leaned in, softening her voice the way she used to when she wanted to smooth things over. We need you, Danielle. The company's falling apart without those approvals. Can't we just move past this? He took a sip of water, let her words hang between them like smoke, then set the glass down with precision. Noel's wrong. Rachel doesn't get to pin this mess on anyone else. You both signed off on it. Vanessa blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. Julian, please, she whispered, voice cracking for the first time, her confidence slipping. Just sign off on the IP, we'll figure out a role for you. A role? Like a favor, like he was some intern begging to be let back in. Daniel wiped his hands on a napkin and met her eyes. Not cold, not angry, just done. You fired me like I was nothing, Vanessa. Like I didn't matter. Now, you deal with the consequences. She fell silent, her expression faltering, the old tricks no longer working. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't soften. Whatever they'd once had, love, trust, partnership, it had been burned away the moment she sat silent in that boardroom, and he had no interest in salvaging ashes. Danielle had just finished his lunch when the call came in. Marco, again voice low and urgent. Emergency board meeting tomorrow. They want you there. Not as an employee, as executive chairman of the IP holding. Daniel froze mid-motion, fork hovering above his plate. Executive chairman. Not a patch-up job. Not a seat at the same old table. The seat. Above Vanessa. Above Rachel. With real power. The kind that came with a pen that could rewrite everything. He leaned back, heart steady, mind racing. What's the deal? He asked. Marco sighed, worn, thin. The company's bleeding out. Clients are gone. Staff's leaving. The board's done with the girls' mess. We're voting on new leadership. They want you at the top. Daniel didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The power shift was already in motion. Later that night, another message came through. Raphael's pushing hard for you. Daniel typed back. He called. I'm in. But he didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy, and this time he wasn't coming back to fix their mistakes. He was coming back to build something better. The next morning he arrived at the office at 9 a.m. sharp, tailored suit, crisp tie, eyes forward. The boardroom wasn't the same room he'd been fired in. It was colder, quieter. But now, it belonged to him. He laid out the terms with clarity and precision. We freeze the IP until we have new terms, ones that protect the company, the people, the future. I'm not here to sink it. I'm here to save it. Heads nodded around the table, even from those who'd once stayed silent. Vanessa looked up briefly, their eyes meeting for just a second, and then hers dropped. She knew it was over. The takeover, the schemes, the smug certainty, all of it. Daniel had returned. Not as the husband they underestimated, but as the leader they couldn't touch. Months had passed. The dust had settled, but Daniel was far from finished. He stood in his new office, not the one he used to share with Vanessa, but a space cleared out just for him. Big windows, clean lines, a view of the city that reminded him how far he'd come. The company was breathing again. Clients were back. Investors, too. Staff walked the halls with purpose, not fear. People shook his hand in the lobby, not out of formality, but out of trust. Vanessa? She kept her distance. She sent her reports on time now. Precise, professional, cold. Daniel didn't mind. She had her role, quiet, contained, no longer dangerous. He'd made it clear, this wasn't a dynasty anymore, it was a business, and it would run by merit, not blood. He rewrote the bylaws himself, one clause at a time. Transparent hiring, clear authority, IP tied to results, not family name. No one would ever do to someone else what they'd done to him. The team he built now, loyal, driven, and grateful. One new hire caught him near the elevator. Thanks for this, Daniel. It feels different here now. He clapped the kid's shoulder and smiled. That's the point. He'd unfrozen the IP a few weeks after the board vote, renegotiated contracts himself, and watched the company not just survive, but thrive, because now every decision passed through one desk, his. The drive home was quiet, the city lights flickering past like memories. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, didn't feel heavy anymore. It was just walls and windows. He poured a drink, sat back, and smiled to himself. Not the fake kind, the real one, the one that came from knowing you rewrote the rules and won. Tomorrow, he'd keep building. And they'd never forget who held it together.